Welcome to the Coroner's Report. Before we begin, please remember this is a true crime podcast with adult themes. Please be aware all of the contemporary witnesses to this case are deceased. We used actors to voice the exact words the witnesses once used. Please remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. A train rolls into town, hissing to a stop with steam billowing around as passengers get off. A short man with a weathered, pained face struggles with his satchel. He's a salesman and determined. The man walks with the aid of 2 crutches, and each step is a testament to that determination. Lower Arkansas in the summer is hot and oppressive, but this particular August day is slightly cooler, a welcome relief. Slowly, the man begins to make his way to the city park. Echoing off in the distance is a passionate preacher practicing for an upcoming outdoor revival in that city park. The man finds respite under a large, shady tree, and he carefully settles down, leaning against the tree and listening to the sermon. And this is where our mystery begins.
Hallelujah.
My name is Steve Navoychek, and welcome back to the Coroner's Report. I'm a retired coroner of 2 of the largest counties in Arkansas and a former state crime lab director. Tracy and I have reviewed several of my old cases, but this time we are looking at a case from long ago, long before my time. Being a coroner is an interesting job. Sometimes the coroner is the first-line investigator in a homicide, but much more often the coroner is called out to a death by natural causes. Sometimes, too, a death by natural causes creates a long unsolved mystery, especially when the dead has no name.
This time, we're going way back in time to the past, 1911. That same year, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City tragically claimed the lives of 146 people. The U.S. Supreme Court declared Standard Oil a monopoly. The first Indianapolis 500 took place. IBM was incorporated, and Fenway Park opened in Boston. But in a small town in Arkansas, a man sat down against a tree to listen to a preacher, slipping quietly away without any identification. And our mystery began.
How can a man forgotten in life become famous in death? It all began on a warm summer day, August 20th, 1911, in Prescott, Arkansas. The little railroad town was founded in 1874 when the Cairo and Fulton Railroad decided to make a train stop. Little Prescott quickly grew because of the timber and cotton all grown locally and shipped across the country by train.
Trees and cotton weren't the only things the trains transported. Passenger trains were the primary mode of transportation in 1911, and the railroad played a significant role in the little town of Prescott, with a population of just 2,700 people. The town was home to merchants, schools, and churches, creating a close-knit community. And on Sunday, the Lord's Day, everyone went to church and gathered for lunch with their families and friends.
If you were lucky, there might be a tent revival in town with a soul-saving, preaching, music, and food.
Old Mike saw that when he rolled into town as a peddler selling pencils, combs, and stationery. Despite being handicapped, possibly due to a stroke or an accident, he worked hard. He used 2 canes to get around as he traveled all across Arkansas selling his goods. Wayne Johnson spoke of what he remembered.
I think he was thought of as a hobo. He was seen around town selling shoestrings, pencils, that type of thing.
Can you imagine the dedication of a man who sells his wares door to door while struggling to even walk?
You know, you do what you do to feed yourself. But no, I can't imagine. That took determination and, grit.
Old Mike came to town regularly, almost like he was on a schedule. Every 3 or 4 weeks, he would arrive on a southbound train, stay overnight at Black's Hotel, peddle his wares, and then hop on the same southbound train the next day, headed for the next stop of Texarkana.
Old Mike was spotted all over the southwestern part of the state, peddling his wares. Little Rock, Hot Springs, Benton, Arkadelphia, and Texarkana were all towns connected by the rails. He'd been traveling the same route since about 1908. It made sense, yet no one bothered to know his name.
It was a Sunday, and the Methodist Church was gearing up for a September revival. The pastor planned to preach at 8:15 that evening to prepare for the revival. The subject of the sermon was the diversity of human needs and the infinite supply. Old Mike settled down against a tree in the city park and did a little people watching.
No one knows exactly when he died, but the newspapers reported his body was found at 8 a.m. and that he died about 2 hours prior. But he hadn't moved since the revival the night before.
Old Mike was found sitting upright against a large oak tree in the city park. Either the milkman or Emma O'Halloran discovered him. There was no sign of foul play. It appeared that he had simply died of natural causes.
There was no identification in his pocket, no wallet, no name. The newspapers gave a full description.
The dead man was about 5 feet and 4 inches high with a stout build. He had brown eyes, brown hair, and he was partially bald with an old scar on top of his head. He had 2 gold teeth and a brown handlebar mustache. On his right arm, between the elbow and wrist, he had a tattoo with the design of a woman standing on a pedestal. His left leg is a little shorter than his right, with a stiff ankle. He was wearing a pair of number 6 shoes by the Foreman Shoe Company of Chicago and a black felt hat.
His body was taken to the Prescott Hardware Company, which also served as the city's morgue, and the investigation began.
Dr. William Rice served as the county coroner, and a jury was chosen to conduct a coroner's inquest. During the inquest, it was revealed that the deceased man had been spotted in Little Rock, Arkadelphia, and Gurdon over the past 10 days. Additionally, on the day before his death, he had been seen in Prescott and the city park during the revival. The newspaper reported what items were found on his body.
There was nothing at all found in his clothes that would lead to his identity. His pockets contained less than $2 in change, a piece of chewing tobacco, 2 handkerchiefs, and the lead pencils. He had on a coat that was sold by some Texarkana firm, but the name was so dim that it could not be read.
Dr. William Rice strongly believed the distinctive features of the deceased man and the contents of his pockets would make identification easier.
The deceased suffered a stroke or injury to his right arm and left leg, spoke English with a slight accent, possibly Italian, had no known permanent address, but he had very nice dentistry. Our local dentist thought the work was done in Europe, New York, or Boston. O.R. Ellsworth photographed the dental work, and we sent photos off to dentists in Boston and New York City. No one recognized the work.
Mr. McElrath told the jury that he had seen the dead man in the drunk tank in Little Rock. McElrath testified that the deceased had been in the company of a man named Pat McFarland, and both had been charged with drunkenness, and they were ordered by the judge to leave Little Rock. McElrath said that Mike had told him he had a brother living in Chicago, but he didn't know his name.
The story may sound unbelievable, but Little Rock is only about 100 miles away from Prescott, and it's on the main rail line. So this could really be just a strange coincidence, or it might be factual. When researchers checked, they found a listing for a Pat McFarland on the police docket published in the Arkansas Gazette on August 12, 1911. The only other man listed for drunkenness on the docket was a man named J.M. Estes. So maybe that's our old Mike. I mean, how many J.M. Esteses could there be in Arkansas during those years? Well, there was a lot, and we checked each and every one of them, and every combination looking for that one guy who could be our J.M. Estes. Yep, we checked all the Johns and the James and the Jims and the Jeremiahs, any combination, utilizing census records, marriage records, birth records, and death records. Sadly, death certificates in Arkansas were not required until 1914, but we do have the 1910 census and the 1917 World War I draft registration. All combinations of J and M Estes were all found alive after 1911. That doesn't mean that our J.M. Estes might have come to Arkansas after the 1910 census was taken, and we just missed him.
Still another witness told the jury that they had seen the deceased in Gurdon and Arkadelphia before his death. Both towns are railroad towns, so that does make sense.
Poor old Mike, more famous in death than in life. The coroner clearly described him, hoping someone would step forward with a name.
The deceased was a cripple and used 2 crutches, and evidently made his living by selling lead pencil, as there were a dozen or more in his pocket.
The jury verdict was read.
We, the jury, find that the deceased came to his death by unknown means.
The newspapers reported his final cause of death.
The doctors are of the opinion that he was suffering from rheumatism and that it had struck his heart.
The newspaper reports of the incident were limited, with only one publication outside the region covering the story. The last contemporary article was published just 10 days later in Little Rock with the Arkansas Gazette.
The body of the man found dead in the city park on Monday morning, August 21st, is still being held for identification by Undertaker J.D. Cornish at his establishment. The man was about 45 years old, about 5 foot 4 inches in height. He was a cripple and used crutches. On his right arm, the figure of a woman has been tattooed.
If someone was searching for old Mike, they wouldn't find any information about his death except in the newspaper in Prescott.
At first, I thought it was strange there was only one article, but even today, do we really see news reports of unidentified bodies? It's hard to believe that many people go unidentified even in today's world, until I did some research. In 2019, according to the National Crime Information Center, 683 deceased individuals all across the country died and were never identified. So it still happens today.
Today, we can collect fingerprints and DNA before burying unidentified individuals. But that wasn't done for this unknown deceased man. His body was taken to the Cornish undertakers.
I am Dr. John D. Cornish, and I embalmed the body. I didn't do anything special. I just used the formula we always used. We embalmed him with his mouth and his eyes closed, but his skin tightened over time as the body dried out, and we had to refit his eyes with eye caps. I put him on display, hoping that some family would be able to identify him. No missing persons report was ever filed to fit his description. We just decided to name him Mike, so we had a name.
Abby Burnett wrote the book Gone to the Grave, Burial Customs of the Arkansas Ozarks, 1850 to 1950, and she agreed to talk with us about old Mike.
The undertaker in Prescott was J.D. Cornish, and obviously, embalming would have been expensive in that day. It wouldn't have been something everybody would have needed. If you've buried right away, you wouldn't have had to embalm. Spending money on an indigent is an odd thing for an undertaker to do. I don't really buy the thought that we'll keep him above ground in case somebody comes to claim him. Given that he was found with no money on him, he was known to people because he apparently traveled through different towns peddling, so people would have recognized him. So why this body of old Mike would have been embalmed and not buried is really an interesting part of the story, I think. I sort of wonder if maybe Cornish wanted to have a body as an attraction.
During our research, we learned there were several other bodies across the state that were embalmed and set aside. They may not have been as popular as old Mike, but they also waited decades for proper burial.
Many funeral homes over-embalm. They triple-embalm them because back in the day, I don't know about still, but most of them would not bury a body until they had payment. So therefore, they would hard embalm them and stick them in a back room, and that may be what happened in this case.
In an era where undertakers had to really work to convince the public that embalming was a good thing, having a body in your funeral home wasn't the worst thing to happen. The idea of keeping a body unburied for people to look at, getting some attention and convincing people that this is a great thing to do, look how well preserved, might have been going on with Cornish and old Mike.
So when did embalming come into being? Abby Burnett, once again, has those answers for us.
Embalming started before the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln's death is credited with being where the public first got interested and started wanting it for themselves. Because, his funeral train, taking his body back to Springfield, made many, many stops. Now, they had a traveling undertaker because the body was still breaking down. The undertaker had putting on more and more mortician's wax. He had to keep putting makeup on the body because it was deteriorating. But the idea was people saw the president embalmed and were very impressed by this. And I think that's when it starts to become acceptable.
If you like the Coroner's Report and the programming we're providing, please remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so we can keep providing quality programming. Like and subscribe today. Our whole culture has changed over time. Back then, we were all much, much closer to death. And deaths, well, they kind of became community events.
In 1911, you still have the labor force that you need to do a home burial. Burying is very labor intensive. And in 1911, you are still going to be relying more on your relatives and your neighbors going to help. There was sort of a taboo against family laying out their own dead. But really it was a community event. So as a person is dying, neighbors are sitting up, and then they'll wake the family if they think that the death is just about to happen. And then the minute the person dies, the body has to be washed, dressed, and positioned before rigor mortis sets in. And you don't know when the rigor is going to happen. If you don't have an access to a coffin, you prefer to have one that was made for the person. So men are going to start building a coffin. You dig the grave on the same day as the burial. And all of these things are being done by members of the community because you will help them in their time of need.
All across the state, and really even the country, there were folks who ended up at the undertakers with no identification. Abby says while there were a few displays like Old Mike, most were buried.
Shortly before Old Mike had died, another body was found in Prescott. This was 1911, and it was a man who was struck and killed by a freight train. And in that case, Cornish was able to make a tentative identification as a man named W.C. Heber. And that's because a surname was written on the man's collar, and there was a monogrammed handkerchief. But that man had muddy in the lining of his coat. So Cornish, in a sense, was paid for his services, and he buried him.
So we've got this dead guy hanging around with no name. You gotta wonder, how did he get his name Old Mike?
Wayne Johnson, a longtime employee, says he didn't remember why they called him Old Mike.
I don't know why the late John Cornish kept the man or how the nickname Old Mike was given to the corpse. I don't know what kind of reasons. He just never buried. Mike was placed in the cabinet years ago. He was just standing in the cabinet. I don't know why we did that. Nothing else was in the cabinet. We could just open the doors and look at him.
Soon people from all over the area started making their way to Prescott, Arkansas to visit Old Mike. Sadly, Old Mike's family never arrived. But there he was, dressed in a suit with a white shirt and a tie. He was a dapper corpse. Dr. John Cornish continued to care for his body.
Every few years, we remove him from his cabinet at the funeral home and giving a good scrubbing and redress him in fresh clothes. Over time, his skin darkened and the body shrank from 5'4" to 4'5", and his weight dropped from 125 to 50 pounds as he lost water over time.
While Dr. Cornish stated that it was a standard embalming, some of the rumors around Prescott suggested that he used an extra strong embalming concoction. In any case, Old Mike remained recognizable for a long, long time. Blue Avery worked at the funeral home.
In my opinion, he has some of the most beautiful gold work in his lower teeth that I've ever seen. We won't bury him as long as he holds up, and I believe he'll hold up indefinitely. Some have asked why we keep him. Well, the reason is that it is such a good job of embalming. Some people even today have doubts about him being dead.
Abby Burnett, who wrote Gone to the Grave, The Burial Customs of the Arkansas Ozarks from 1850 to 1950, found the dental work curious.
Well, it's true. He had very elaborate dental work. So you could maybe make a case that he came from money, but at the same time, somebody who was selling pencils in the town park and coming through periodically doesn't seem like somebody who's going to have moneyed relatives out looking for him.
With only one newspaper outside of Prescott carrying the story, our friend Abby found that also very telling.
He has an unusual tattoo. If you wanted to get the word out and try and help somebody find their dead loved one, yes. Why wasn't it all over the newspapers?
Over time, his skin dried out and began to darken, and somehow he became a rather ghastly tourist attraction. And somewhere along the way, someone decided to paint eyes on his eyelids, creating a permanent, ghostly, unfocused stare.
Old Mike was placed upright in a padded cabinet, propped up on his crutches in the back room of the undertaker's office inside a closet. His body was hidden by a curtain that had to be drawn back. To see him clearly, you also had to reach in and pull the chain to turn on the light.
You know, Steve, nightmares are made of that. There is no way I would reach into a dark cabinet and pull a chain to see a dead body. But I do remember seeing Old Mike. I was just a little bitty kid, and my dad told me he was a wooden Indian. His skin did darken over time, but there's no evidence that he was a Native American.
As creepy as all that sounds, that really was the custom of the day. There were several unidentified bodies throughout the state that were on display at the time looking for family members.
Old Mike stood there for over 60 years, just waiting. Dying is scary. Dying alone? Well, that's got to be more frightening. But dying and losing your name, it's just all so sad.
During the 1950s and 60s, Old Mike became a local legend in Prescott. Kids would dare each other to visit him at the funeral home, and the staff there was happy to oblige.
Jimmy Smith was just a kid growing up in Prescott, but he remembers.
I can attest to the fact that he was indeed placed in an upright position for years at the Cornish mortuary. Being childish, I shook his tie one day. A silver dollar fell out. It was explained to me the dollar was placed there in order to keep his tie hanging straight. Mr. McBrayer gave me that dollar for good luck. That happened almost 70 years ago.
The Cornish Funeral Home declined offers to feature Old Mike in a traveling carnival or circus over the years. Blue Avery, who worked for the funeral home, quickly dismissed that idea.
They wanted to know if we'd sell him, but we couldn't from an ethical standpoint.
The funeral home also put Old Mike to work when they propped him up next to a new hearse that they had bought in the 1920s for a promotional photograph. Abby Burnett believes this is also a clue to why Old Mike ended up embalmed and unburied.
Buying a new hearse was something that would usually make the newspapers. It was a very big deal, and they're trying to show people why you want to use them and not use the old way. The old way was your neighbors showed up with a wagon and they would haul a body to the graveyard for you. You didn't call the funeral home. So undertakers had an uphill battle to say to people, look, we can do everything you're already doing. Well, why should you pay us when your neighbors would do it for free? And they used all kinds of things to try and gain public trust. People collect the giveaways that funeral homes used to hand out. I have a little pocket mirror, fly swatter, thermometers. There used to make little balsa wood airplanes to give the children. They had the undertaker's name and address on it. Why, if you're the only undertaker in the whole county, you need to do that. But they really believed in getting their name out there. So having people constantly coming to your funeral home to see Old Mike is a much cheaper way than handing out little trinkets. I really think that Cornish saw an opportunity to do some advertising. He now had a prop. Having a rigidly embalmed body standing next to the new hearse would just be great advertising.
There are some reports that Old Mike, he even went to visit the post office and was on display there for a short time.
They propped him up and they put cigarettes in his hand and cards. They propped up and like he was playing a hand of cards. People danced with the corpse.
Sort of like Weekend at Bernie's?
Oh, yes, Steve, just like Weekend at Bernie's. There's reports that some high school kids might have taken Old Mike for a quick walk down the street to a movie theater once. And Sandra, well, she remembers visiting her grandparents, and part of visiting her grandparents was stopping by to say hello to Old Mike.
I, too, remember the trips to the Cornish mortuary in the 50s to see Old Mike. My father, A.A. McKinnon, would often take my two brothers and I through the nearby park to show us where they found him. A trip from Shreveport to Prescott to visit my grandparents was not complete without a visit to see Old Mike. I later took my own kids there to see him.
People today still remember seeing Old Mike as kids. Terry Vandiver, a local resident, remembers Old Mike fondly.
I grew up here, still live here, but I do remember that era where we could go observe him. And that was the entertainment for, if I had a cousin to come to town from out of state, that's where I would take them. That's what we did.
It seems that Old Mike, well, he became the most popular fellow in town thanks to Mr. Cornish.
I think he was advertising from the very beginning. If you're an undertaker who is used to having to buy things to give away and run ads in the paper, so you have a chance to take an indigent body and show it off to the public and stay in the public's mind. And you have the school basketball team all coming by for a good luck charm, to seeing Mike or touching Mike, or people coming in to give themselves a thrill. It's just one more way of keeping your business in people's minds.
But by the 1960s, his longtime caretaker, John Cornish, had little hope that Old Mike would be identified. I mean, after all, it had been 50 years.
By the mid-60s, times were changing, and one employee of the funeral home thought that it was time for a proper burial. His name was Henry Shackelford.
It was time. We had trouble with local teens coming in and pulling his pants down, tying ribbons to him, unbuttoning his shirt and putting things in his mouth.
Shackelford set out on a mission and started writing letters. He called the State Department of Health and the Board of Embalmers and Funeral Home Directors. The Health Department decided Mike really wasn't a health hazard, but the Board of Embalmers and Funeral Home Directors thought it was bad publicity to display a long dead body.
It was during this time period that the state passed a new law requiring bodies to be buried in a reasonable time frame. It's kind of sad that a law had to be passed to require the disposal of a dead body, right?
In the end, the Cornish Funeral Home, which had cared for old Mike all these years, decided it was time to lay their old friend to rest. But not everyone was happy with the decision. Thomas Cobb was the Cornish Funeral Home mortician.
They had waited so long for someone to identify him. He was just like part of the town. The townspeople were awfully disappointed that the funeral service was ordered to bury old Mike. He wasn't a health hazard. There was no way he could have been.
The funeral home decided to hold a private funeral with no press coverage, but photos were taken at the scene. They purchased a cemetery plot and a coffin for old Mike, who was then buried in Deanne Cemetery. Shackelford generously donated a suit for the occasion.
The plot was marked by a donated headstone featuring his name as Old Mike and his date of death. Later, someone anonymously donated a nicer stone that included the engraving of a pencil on it. Pastor Jerry Westmoreland performed the ceremony, and the theme of the funeral was, "We might not know who old Mike was, but God does." Westmoreland grew up in Prescott and remembered old Mike fondly from childhood.
Yeah, you would dare your friend to touch him. All you had to do is go to the funeral home and ask to see old Mike, and they'd usher you right back to the back. They had him behind a curtain, and then they'd draw back the curtain, and there he'd be.
Local resident Terry Vandiver remembers visiting old Mike in the early 70s.
We would go all the way to the back through the funeral home, and there was a hallway. I remember a light switch, a string that you would turn on. Sometimes we had to open the door to look at him.
Even toward the end of his time at the funeral home, Mike still was recognizable.
He had on a brown suit. They did have a suit on him. He had brown skin. I just remember how little he was. I was probably taller than him, even being, like in 7th, 8th grade, something like that. I do remember his left leg was a little shorter. It was kind of crooked, but I do remember him being kind of bald. It was just creepy, to look at him.
Time changes. What was acceptable in 1911 was not as acceptable in 1975, but there wasn't a real reason to bury the man after all those years, other than the obvious.
Steve, you're right. Our opinions do change over time, and even the residents of Prescott today who fondly remember old Mike, they realize how this would never happen today. Terry Vandiver explains.
We never did make fun of him or anything like that. We were known for that. It was our attraction of our town that we did have this because nobody else had a dead body on display. We just probably didn't think of him either as a real person at one time, just kind of looked at him like a dummy until you get older and realize really what we did. We put a dead person on display. It does sound kind of horrible that we did that, but I'm sure we did that so people could come from different towns and maybe have been identified. I'm sure that was their goal. Then it just turned into an attraction.
As a member of the Board of Embalmers, we just figured it was time for him to be buried. It was the proper thing to do.
Abby Burnett still believes old Mike wasn't embalmed for identification purposes.
So again, with Mr. Estes or old Mike, saying, we thought he'd be identified is a little odd because embalming at that time, 1911, I really think the reason a person would pay for that was just to get relatives there for a funeral.
Who knows the real reason behind Old Mike being on display? And no matter the reason, Old Mike became the mascot of the funeral home and somewhat a morbid tourist attraction for the town. The population of Prescott has not grown much. Only 3,600 people live there today. And today, there's a display about Old Mike at the Nevada County Depot and Museum. The museum is working diligently on a fundraiser, hoping to raise money to create a more lifelike mannequin to represent Mike. It's been 50 years since Old Mike was finally buried, and 113 years since he died. Yet the town still remembers him. After all, he lived among them for 64 years, just standing there, waiting.
As weeks turned into months and months into years, Old Mike might have passed away without a name, but he eventually became the most renowned resident of Prescott.
This concludes this episode of the Coroner's Report. If you like our content, please remember to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us on our website at coronersreport.net or on any social media platform at Coroner's Report.
Special thanks goes to Terry Vandiver for sharing her memories, and Guy Lancaster with the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies, along with Jamie Simmons with the Nevada County Depot and Museum, and Amy Burnett, the author of Gone to the Grave, Burial Customs of the Arkansas Ozarks 1850 to 1950. This book is available from the University Press of Mississippi.
Also, thanks to voice actors J.D. West, Sean Davis, Alan Prather, and Savvy Valentine. Copyright 2024 Aussie Grove Media Group, LLC.